afternoon and welcome. It is my privilege to welcome you to the annual Harris Lecture at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. This is one of our most important endowed lectures, and we're honored this year to welcome a wonderful speaker and a good friend of the law school. Before I introduce the Harris Lecture and also this year's speaker, I want to note that this was a special event. Not only is this IU's bicentennial that we're doing with the Harris Lecture, this is also being held in conjunction with the Bradley Volter Colloquium in Criminal Law and Criminal Procedure. We not only have a group of students visiting us, law scholars from Poland. Do we have those students currently here? Can you raise your hands and maybe a round of applause for the group that's come? And we also have many Bradley Fellows in the audience. If you're a Bradley Fellow, can you also raise your hand from the U.S. side? Thanks for coming. The Bradley Volter Colloquium was a vision from Professor Joe Hoffman to honor the late Craig Bradley, and really is unique in its interdisciplinary connection between two fabulous law schools in Poland. And so many thanks to Joe for that vision and making this happen. A round of applause for Professor Hoffman. Marion's giving away microphones.
There's supposed to be students manning these microphones. If you're here, please come take them. It's a Q&A, and if you're not on mic, you're not going to be here for the recording. Well, when you get here, then
One other quick announcement is at 2:30 this afternoon up in the faculty lounge, students that would like to have an informal, casual conversation with our guest, you're more than welcome to join us up there. The Harris Lecture was established in 1946 and is our oldest endowed lecture. The series is named after Addison C. Harris, who was born in 1840 and lived until 1916. Addison Harris was a distinguished Indiana lawyer and statesman, a member of the state Senate, and a minister to Austria-Hungary. He grew up in Indiana, and was one of the state's most well-known lawyers. After his diplomatic post, he returned to Indiana, serving as the president to the University of Indianapolis, a founder and president to the Indiana Bar Association, a founder and president to the Indianapolis Bar Association, and the president of Purdue University's Board of Trustees. The formal launch of the Addison Harris Lecture Series began in 1958 with the dedication address of Chief Justice Earl Warren, who dedicated the address at the same time as he dedicated the start of the new law building. Past Harris Lectures have included some of the most prominent and distinguished scholars and legal minds of our generation. They are people who have changed the way we think about the law and have had a tremendous impact on law and legal institutions. Over the decades, they've included such well-known people as Carl Llewellyn, Robert Loeffler, Robert Bork, Guido Calabresi, John Hart Ely, and more recently, such well-known scholars as Judith Resnick, Mari Matsuda, Martha Minow, Riva Segal, Elizabeth Warren, Cass Sunstein, Julian Bond, Doug Kaiser, and Jack Bolkin. Their remarks have all been published in the Indiana Law Journal. Today is my great pleasure to add to this long list of distinguished speakers. Dr. Adam Bodnar has been the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Poland since September 2015. As Commissioner, he has relentlessly initiated and intervened in litigation on behalf of those suffering discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, age, disability, gender, and sexual orientation. He's also been sought to convince legislators and government officials to respect the constitutional principles of equal treatment. Dr. Bodnar has been central to the ongoing battle to try to save the rule of law in Poland. He has courageously defended the Polish courts against repeated and concerted attacks on judicial independence by the government, most notably the controversial legislation enacted in 2017 to compel the retirement and replacement of all sitting Polish Supreme Court judges. The plan ultimately was thwarted due to public pressure within Poland, as well as intense criticism from abroad, eventually culminating in an October 2018 decision against the plan by the European Court of Justice that led to its final abandonment. Dr. Bodnar holds a PhD in constitutional law from the University of Warsaw, where he serves as a professor and the chair of human rights, and an LLM in comparative constitutional law from Central European University in Budapest, where he's a visiting professor. He currently supervises two of our students as Stewart Fellows each summer. Dr. Bodnar will be speaking today on human rights and power, the Polish road to the illiberal state. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Adam Bodnar.
Dear Mr. Dean, I would like to thank you very much for this invitation to deliver Edison Clay Harris Memorial Lecture. It is really a great honor and privilege. I would like also to thank Professor Joseph Hoffman for his continuous support to Polish cause. I would like to start by just giving you two snapshots. It is a photo when Lech Wałęsa, Solidarity leader, on 16th November 1989, made a powerful speech in the US Congress. It was a symbolic moment because this moment symbolized the start of the Polish road regaining towards full independence and the establishing a constitutional democracy. At that time, Lech Wałęsa thanked the American nation for the support for the democracy cause in Poland. And it's quite interesting that he started his speech with words, "We the people." With this speech, Poland has really re-emerged as a democracy. We joined Council of Europe, NATO, the European Union. Market economy, except for early period, has continuous economic growth. And since 1989, the Polish economy is 3 times larger than it was at that time. And basically, this Polish road towards democracy is a success, is regarded commonly as a success story. But let me take another snapshot. It is just after 30 years after the speech of Lech Wałęsa, Poland is subject to the rule of law procedure in the European Union. There are a few judgments already issued by the European Union Court of Justice. Poland is also the only EU state which is included into the special monitoring procedure by the Council of Europe, Parliamentary Assembly. And just recently, Polish judges have organized like a massive demonstration, so-called March of 10,000 Guns, protesting against threats to judicial independence. And just a couple of days ago, 2 congressmen, Elliot Engel and Bill Keating, sitting on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, have sent a joint letter to Polish authorities, and they claimed that the muzzle law, so-called muzzle law that was subject of proceedings in the Polish parliament, is a further threat to Polish judicial independence. They said enacting this law would represent a significant step backward for Poland's historically strong leadership in democratic reforms in Europe. The erosion of democratic principles would undermine the great strides Poland has made through the decades to build a modern democratic country. So the question is, if we look at these snapshots, how did it happen? What went wrong? Why such a dramatic change has been possible? And is it a part of a general trend, or is it just like a Polish-specific case? And let me answer those questions by presenting how it basically went through, by presenting the story of dismantling rule of law in Poland. And this story is far from being over. Second, it is not a very typical story. It is also a story which gives some hope for future because of resistance of number of people. First of all, I would like to present something what I would name like a trajectory of changes in Poland. And please accept my apologies for not being very detailed on some issues, especially my Polish friends. Please accept that I will omit some of the facts, because it will be quite impossible to limit myself within this time and to give detailed overview of everything what was happening. Because one of the most important aspects of this change that happened is that it was not a sudden one. It is not the story that can be made like a Hollywood movie, that you are making like a change of a system overnight. It is a process which takes years, but after a number of years, you see that that your country is a pretty different country than it was a couple of years ago. And one of the politicians named this process a so-called creeping coup d'etat. I would like to start by showing a picture of this man. It is Viktor Orban, leader of Hungary, who stated that his idea is to create so-called illiberal state. And Polish leaders, especially Jarosław Kaczyński, leader of the Law and Justice Party, has proclaimed already in 2012 that he is going to build Budapest in Warsaw. So basically it was like a pattern to be repeated in Poland. And when Law and Justice won elections in 2015, basically Poland repeated to great extent some of the scenarios and some of the methods that have been previously implemented by Viktor Orban, with one significant difference. Polish ruling party, Law and Justice, didn't win constitutional majority. They just won a simple majority, which gave this party a possibility to adopt different legislative changes. But they were quite well instructed how to do it because of the example of Hungary, how to play with arguments, how to present propaganda messages, how to make a dialogue or so-called constructive dialogue with international institutions. And the process of changes started with this beautiful room, which is the room of headquarters of the Polish Constitutional Court. In Poland we have three top courts: Supreme Administrative Court, Supreme Court, and Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court is responsible for judicial review, for evaluation of legislative acts. And the process of changes started with this. Basically, Polish ruling party adopted a series of different laws concerning the operation of the Constitutional Court that heavily restricted the way how the court should operate. But the most important aspect of this was packing in the court with people who were loyal, people who were elected by the new party in order to achieve as soon as possible the majority in the Constitutional Court. Within this process, there were certain violations of the Constitution, especially because Polish president decided not to swear in judges of the Constitutional Court that have been elected by the previous parliament. And it was a violation of the Constitution, but basically what has been done, the new parliament has decided to annul resolutions of the previous parliament and to elect new people in place of this. It was quite a complicated process, quite a long battle, and a lot of people were engaged into this. There are big books written on this process and big opinions of international bodies such as the Venice Commission. But the end effect was such that by the end of 2016, the Constitutional Court has not been any longer an independent institution of judicial review, and also the Chief Justice, because of the lapse of the constitutional term, because of the expiry of the constitutional term, has been changed into the new one who has been strongly connected with the ruling party. And this newly elected Chief of Justice, Mrs. Julia Przyłębska, was quite I would say strategic in controlling the docket of cases and also with changing compositions of judicial panels, adjudicated cases of some political importance. So the Constitutional Court, as of now, it exists, but it is mostly a facade institution. So you cannot expect anything good from the point of view of reviewing acts of, let's say, political importance by the Constitutional Court. Quite otherwise, the institution is used from time to time in order to legitimize some laws that have been passed by the parliament. Please note that this political subordination of the Constitutional Court has been subject of observance of a number of international bodies, including European Union, Venice Commission. Also, Barack Obama, when he was in Poland in summer 2016, made a statement during the NATO summit that was taking place in Warsaw. But all this criticism coming from abroad didn't stop Polish authorities because they regarded the subordination of the Constitutional Court as the central element in creating like the full power in a country. Interestingly, in 2016, when the whole public attention has been concentrated on the independence, on saving the independence of the Constitutional Court, in the meantime, the parliament has adopted a couple of laws that strengthened the state apparatus. So, for example, the office of the Minister of Justice has been merged with the office of the Prosecutor General. Please note, we had this system before 2010, but this time it was not only this merger, amalgamation of two institutions, Prosecutor General and the Minister of Justice, but also giving a lot of individual powers to Prosecutor General, Minister of Justice, to influence almost any investigation that is taking place in the country, and a lot of measures of creating subordination and hierarchical discipline of all the prosecutors in the service, including degradation of some of the most professional ones, some of those integral ones. The second change concerns secret services and extension of different surveillance powers. Please note that until today we do not have a real democratic oversight concerning operation of secret services, so you can imagine how dangerous it could be from the point of view of civil liberties. The third point was the abolition of the independent and non-partisan character of the civil service. Basically, Polish civil service was built on the European tradition that it should be as much as possible independent from politicians. But the Law and Justice Party has broken basically this idea. And also there was one law, I will say one word more about this, concerning the public radio and broadcasting that was adopted also in the same time. But please note that all those legislation pieces, except for the public radio and broadcasting law, could not be subject of proper judicial review. And after 2017, when the Constitutional Court has been already subordinated to the political wishes, it was basically fruitless to continue with those cases. The interesting case is the public broadcasting law. Please note that in Poland, public radio and television is important because it has a very wide coverage, especially in rural areas. So it is not something you can basically neglect and ignore. And also the tradition and the very constitutional principle was such that public radio and broadcasting should be plural and should serve all the political forces in a country. And the law that has been adopted by the Law and Justice, by the Parliament, provided that all the officers and top managers in the public radio and television are basically selected by a body which is elected by the majority in the Parliament. So they had the government had a full impact on who is basically managing public radio and television. And basically, when it happened, the radio and television became like a source of a total governmental propaganda, sometimes even hate speech, sometimes disinformation, and also it was supported with a huge public funding. So even today there is a discussion in the parliament whether public radio and television should be supported with, public television in fact, should be supported with the amount of more or less 500 million euros per year, which is really quite a significant sum as of Poland. And because of this change, the public television had to dismiss a number of journalists. A number of them just left the television because they didn't want to be part of that kind of a propaganda machinery. Why I'm saying that this case is a little bit different? Because with respect to radio and television, there was a judgment of the Constitutional Court. And in fact, this photo, I took this photo on 13th December 2016, when we had an actual case. I was litigating this case before the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court said it's wrong. You cannot make it this way. You cannot circumvent powers of one constitutional body, which is the National Broadcasting Council, and you cannot just create this kind of a political subordination of the public television. And what happened? This judgment has just been ignored. So 4 years. 3-4 years we have after the judgment, and nothing happened. No draft legislation, anything, because it was not material to implement the judgment. And it is one of those features that the government, when it does not like certain judgments, is simply ignoring them. Why? Because there is a lack of responsibility for this, lack of accountability, because the prosecutor general is within the same government. So it shows how this whole machinery started to work. In 2017, the ruling party started to dismantle judicial independence in Poland. This process was very complicated, and the current situation as we have now was not just achieved with one shot, but it was a result of a series of laws. And this change was possible because once again the Constitutional Court couldn't verify those laws. Second, the government was quite skillfully using the argument we need to reform courts, and most of the populations could agree with this because we have some problems with courts' efficiency and accountability to regular people. So it was quite easy to say we have to reform the court, and the general public was not able to protest significantly against this. But still, there were a lot of protests meantime. So for example, it is a photo from one of protests that happened in July 2017. I would like just to give you some ideas, how this change has been managed and achieved. So first of all, under the law on ordinary courts, under the law on common courts, the Minister of Justice has got so-called like the window of opportunity for exchanging personally, individually, all court presidents. Before we had a system that court presidents were nominated by the Minister of Justice, but upon the consent of other judges sitting in the given court. But there was just tricky one small legislative change saying within half a year from the entry into force of the law, the Minister of Justice has a right to appoint new ones. And that's it. This time was needed in order to exchange presidents in major crucial courts. The second interesting development was the change concerning the National Council of Judiciary. It's quite complicated. We have a system in which there is like a very special constitutional body which is responsible for judicial nominations, judicial appointments, and safeguarding judicial independence. And it is an organ that has been construed as a kind of a balance between different branches of power. So you have the representative of judges and representatives of executive and legislative and the parliament. But the majority constitute judges. So 15 members out of 25 are regular judges who have been always elected by peers, so by other judges. But it was not like 100% clear, if you read the constitution, who should elect, and basically over years nobody questioned this. So the government said like this: we need to bring more legitimacy to Polish judiciary. We need to give a voice to a sovereign. The sovereign should decide who is in the National Council of Judiciary. It means it is the parliament who should elect members of the National Council of Judiciary. But in order to increase the legitimacy, we'll make the 3/5 majority in order to elect those judges. So it has been achieved. The whole process was heavily manipulated, and the Ministry of Justice had a huge influence on who is basically there and which judges are nominated. And as a result of this, the National Council of Judiciary stopped to become the independent body safeguarding judicial independence, and it started to appoint new people to Polish courts. Altogether, over the last 2 years, it appointed 500 judges out of 10,000, including some judges to the Supreme Court. The third element of the change was a disciplinary system of judges. New laws created a whole machinery of disciplinary proceedings against judges, including a special chamber in the Supreme Court. Can you imagine that judges in the special chamber of the Supreme Court earn 30% more than regular judges of the Supreme Court? So it was kind of a, one can think, incentive to bring some people into the Supreme Court. And also, the new system provided an institution of like top disciplinary judges. So judges that would discipline, that would start proceedings against other judges. And just guess who is electing those disciplinary judges? Minister of Justice, individually. And the fourth point, the fourth change concerned the Supreme Court. There were a number of changes concerning Supreme Court, including compulsory retirement age including decrease of the retirement age for existing judges of the Supreme Court. And if not the intervention by the European Court of Justice, most probably this change would be achieved. And here you can see it is a very famous picture when Judge Gersdorf, President of the Supreme Court, is basically ignoring the legislative provisions, saying that she is a president of the Supreme Court under the Constitution, and returns or enters the building of the Supreme Court, cheered by the crowd who is basically protesting and supporting her in this endeavor. But the most important change, which still is in force, was the creation of two chambers in the Supreme Court. One chamber which is called Extraordinary Appeals Chamber, and the second disciplinary chamber, and all those new chambers have been packed with new judges. And basically, this fight concerning the independence of the Supreme Court is still going on. It's very, very heavily complicated from the legal point of view. But I think one of them, and this fight is also complicated because of the involvement of the European Union control mechanism. I will later on say a few words about this. But the most important thing that happened recently was a resolution adopted by 3 chambers of the Supreme Court. You see here, these are more or less like 60 judges. One guy, at the top, is basically in this room here, Professor Włodzimierz Wróbel, who was one of the judge rapporteurs, so maybe... And basically the Supreme Court in this resolution said something like this, that there is a possibility of excluding judges from adjudication of cases that were appointed by this newly created National Council of Judiciary. So this is a resolution which is something like the attempt to protect the independence of the Supreme Court. Please note that this process of reducing judicial independence is not yet over. And just recently, Parliament adopted a new law, so-called muzzle law, that is going to silence all the judges who are critical towards those reforms. Moreover, there are more than 40 judges that are having disciplinary cases that are pending against them. And one of them has been just recently suspended as a judge because of making one legal action. And all those disciplinary cases are creating so-called chilling effect. The judges should be aware that, listen, we are looking at you, and you cannot be certain of your position and of your future in a judiciary. The question is how it happened that all those changes could be possible. Because, you know, we can go like in details concerning presentation of those problems. I will try to make my evaluation of reasons and methods that have been implemented. So the first one is the fact that we have a relative economic stability in Poland. 81% of Polish people are more or less like satisfied from their conditions of living, including material conditions. Government invested a lot of money into specific social programs concerning families with children. And also, this social factor is combined with something like populist narrative about national pride, martyrdom of Polish heroes during the Second World War, and a certain vision of Poland opposing threats coming from other parts of the world. And basically, increase of this fear is quite easy, is relatively easier than in other countries because we are quite a homogeneous society. Therefore, the ruling party is able to present itself as a defender of traditional values, family, Christianity, so you can see some kind of similarities with that kind of a tribalism approach to politics. Second, we should mention that level of civic awareness of Polish people is not that high. We had just 30 years of building this legal awareness. Polish elites, to a great extent, neglected like a proper civic education, and that's why. Of course, you had different protests. They were quite massive even concerning all those changes, but still, most of the society does not regard that it is, let's say, their cause. That it is their cause to protest against those changes in the judiciary. Interestingly, one of the consequences of lack of this legal education and legal awareness is the fact that there are like continuous smear campaigns pending against judges as a group, but also against individual judges. So judges are named as extraordinary elites, extraordinary caste. The government is selecting some or singling out some individual cases in order to show certain mistakes or lack of accountability of judges for some mistake. Interestingly, those smear campaigns were also organized by people who were strongly affiliated or that were within the Ministry of Justice. So here you have a photo of one guy who is a judge still, in fact, but he was a deputy minister of justice, and he was found to organize or to arrange the hate campaign together with other judges, and he has been dismissed for this fact. But interestingly, still until today, except for dismissal, he didn't face any responsibility for what happened. I think it is important to say that this change would not happen if not the violation of certain constitutional provisions. But what I would like to underline is that the strategy which was usually used is to present some theoretically neutral or theoretically correct arguments in order to justify some changes. So the good example of this is the change of the retirement age of judges. So the government said, you know, it shouldn't be like this, that in the Supreme Court, the retirement age for judges is 70, while in other courts it's 65. Let's change it, because there should be equality. So we should change it in order to make the same retirement age for all the judges, including judges of the Supreme Court. Interestingly, this change was not going to work pro futuro, but it was going to be applicable to existing judges of the Supreme Court, including the first president of the Supreme Court. So altogether, 20 judges, as a result of this change, has been sent for early retirement. But when anybody asked the government, why are you doing this? They were saying, you know, there should be equality. You know, why they should be somehow, you know, promoted by having like the longer retirement age. They should be equal as other judges. That kind of a technique, like presenting of some kind of a like neutral solutions, and basically by using propaganda, rewriting the context of those solutions, is used like constantly with all different kinds of proceedings, and it is quite difficult for the society to sometimes to react, because you must spend time to explain why this change is taking place this way. Another strategy is a strategy of so-called accomplished facts. It means that, okay, we know, the government most probably knows that it is exceeding certain limits, it is violating certain limits, but it is still going forward. If there is a reaction of international institutions or the European Union, then the government enters into some kind of a dialogue. But in the meantime, the change is achieved, because international institutions must have something like a good faith in negotiations, good faith in understanding, you know, the cause, but this time is used in order to achieve certain steps forward in this dismantling of the rule of law. Another strategy is strategy not to overheat emotions. So, for example, you cannot expect some kind of a physical measures, because the government most probably would know that that kind of use would provoke a lot of public protest. So legal changes are subject of careful propaganda promotion. Disciplinary cases are made step by step, especially with respect to judges who were previously portrayed as enemies of state. And there was only once a situation when the government, let's say, overheated. It was the situation when the law adopted by the Supreme Court provided for dismissal of all existing judges of the Supreme Court, and then cherry picking of those who stay by the Minister of Justice. So that was the moment when people really went massively into streets. They claimed veto from, this is one of the photos, it says veto, from the Polish president, and president basically had to do it, although usually he was legitimizing everything what was done by the parliament. But please note, this mistake of overheating was made only once, because otherwise it is quite difficult for the public opinion to understand the details of all those changes. So we name this process of what is happening as the process of heating the frog, which means that the frog does not realize when it has been cooked. And basically that is what we see. And also all those changes, like taken separately, they could look like quite neutrally, but if they are taken together, they create like a very dangerous cumulative effect. There is also a significant role of lawyers. Of course, some of them are architects of change. Some of them justify those reforms, implement those reforms. But there is like quite a significant group of people who are taking opportunistic choice from the point of view of their career. So they think, okay, I can be a judge of the Supreme Court. In usual circumstances, I would have to wait for this, let's say, additional 15 years. So why not to go there? Or, you know, I was always dreaming about being the president of the court, and finally, you know, I have this opportunity, so I will do it for the, you know, sake of good future Poland. So there are different motivations behind those decisions. But the question is whether this group is big enough and determined to sustain in this endeavor, and basically whether this group that is opposing is also strong enough to create a protest. And of course, ideology plays a certain role in justifying changes. I will not quote, but there is a very good article by Jan Werner Miller in the Project Syndicate about this, that basically use of the ideology is in fact a kind of a weapon that is used with respect to Western partners, but in fact it is not very much about ideology, it is more about avoiding any discussion on chronism, politicization of the judiciary, and control over the media. And but please note, what we are also experiencing is also something like the cultural war, which affects women's rights, LGBT rights, rights of different minorities, and also refugees. And the great ally of the ruling party in this war is, unfortunately, the Catholic Church. Now I would like to turn, if I have still a few minutes, to something what I would name resistance. Polish poet, Nobel Prize winner Czesław Miłosz, in 1947 wrote, I quote, "The avalanche changes direction depending on what rocks it encounters in its path." And basically, end of quote. And basically people are like rocks. If they take the constitution, rule of law, and human rights as granted, the avalanche may just go. You know, those rocks will be flat and easy to overcome. But if people stand up to rights, each rock might be sturdy, massive, colossal, or even monumental. And I claim that number of people basically had this role to be fulfilled. They became those rocks that were trying to resist this avalanche. Why this position of lawyers was important? Because, as I said, you cannot make this like a new system of government within just one day. You have to take months. You have to pretend that you are doing everything legally, lawfully, and within limits of some kind of a constitutional order. You also have to take into account the time, adopt different strategies to the electoral calendar. You have to consider reaction of the public opinion. You have spent some time on discussion with international partners, although you are not really respecting them heavily. You have to analyze polls, or you have to soften your messages. But basically, all of this creates like a space for those who are resisting, for those who are opposing. And in Poland, we see a lot of different activist movements. So one of those resistance methods was civil society activism. Since 2015, we can see the rebirth of the tradition of non-violence protests against undemocratic changes. We also see the involvement of organizations, lawyers' organizations that are participating in different protests, but also try to use their imagination as much as possible to get to the people with the message. So for example, here is a photo, one of the demonstrations in front of the Supreme Court saying, "It is our court," quite a symbolic photo by a very famous photographer. But I would like just to show you another photo. Can you imagine this guy in the middle? He's a judge. It is, his name is Arkadiusz Krupa. It is music festival taking place in Poland, and he's organizing a simulation of court trial, something like mock trial, in order to show to people what is really the court and what is the value of independence. And so you can, Polish judges basically, in order to get some contact with society, started to go for music festivals, started to make different educational activities. But it was a little bit like a situation when you have a difficulty with navigation because, you know, there is a big storm around, and still you are trying to concentrate on repairing sails because they were neglected before, because nobody before took enough care about legal education. Another good example is solidarity of lawyers. It is good that lawyers, attorneys, legal advisors, prosecutors, judges cooperate with each other and they support each other. Like, for example, very prominent lawyers represent judges in all those different disciplinary cases. We also see a birth of something what I would name of constitutional patriotism. So during protests, one symbol has been created, which is the symbol konstytucja. It says konstytucja in Polish, but ty, ja means you, I, which symbolizes that constitution is for you and for me. And basically, it became like a symbol for a number of people who are protesting. I think, you know, I must say a few words about myself. I think my institution proved to be quite useful in the context of those changes, because this institution has been created in '87 as a bridge between old times and new times, as an institution that is like educating the state apparatus how to protect rights. But interestingly, all different powers which the Ombudsman, Commissioner for Human Rights, has proved to be useful in resisting the tide. I think we should also underline the position of judges. Judges behaved and they still behave extraordinarily courageously. You have a lot of judicial leaders who are leaders of judicial associations or who are taking some individual cases. And please note, they face a lot of hatred for this, not only from politicians, but also from like regular people. Just to tell you that President of the Supreme Court has been officially named recently by the President of the Republic as that she is shame as the president. And here you see one of those judges who has been portrayed 3 weeks ago by New York Times, Judge Tuleya, one of the most courageous criminal judges in Poland. And finally, this resistance was also possible not just because of different actions, but also because of the use of legal means. And here the European Union membership was proved to be a crucial factor. Please note that if you compare the relationship between Polish system and the EU system, it is a little bit like in a federation, a little bit, okay? You know, I don't go into details here. We name it that it is a supranational legal order, but in practice it works quite similarly. But one of the key principles of the EU legal order, so if you are a member of the European Union, is the obligation to respect so-called European values, which is democracy, human rights, rule of law, protection of minorities. Moreover, the European Union legal order is based on the principle of mutual assistance, mutual recognition. So you basically courts trust to each other. So in order to implement judgments, in order to implement different kind of, you know, European extradition warrants, you have to trust to each other, which means that you must have a similar system of protection of rights. Interestingly, for years, the European Union was not supervising how the judiciary is construed in different member states, because it was regarded as a predominantly internal issue of Poland. But just recently, there was a judgment in one Portuguese case in which the Court of Justice of the European Union said, we have to examine it because it is material from the point of view of effectiveness of the EU law, effectiveness of the legal protection. If we do not look intensively into legal systems of member states from the point of view of protection of fair trial, we can create a situation when there will be no effective protection of legal rights. So here is a room of the Court of Justice of the European Union that proved to be like one of the most important institutions, because thanks to this court, it was possible, for example, to return those judges that have been sent for early retirement, 20 judges, back to the Supreme Court. There were there were a few other cases, and this resolution of the Supreme Court, I showed you those 60 judges sitting together, was a reaction to one of those judgments that was evaluating the independence of the disciplinary chamber and the independence of the National Council of Judiciary. Right now we are waiting for another interim measure that would be used by the Court of Justice. So what happened is that Court of Justice became a little bit like the quasi-constitutional court for Poland. So we do not have a protection by our own constitutional court, which means we have to rely on the support by the European Court of Justice. But interestingly, Poland became a little bit like a laboratory for creating and shaping practices and rules how this evaluation should look like. Basically, right now, we don't know what will emerge as a result of those provisions. The recently adopted Muzzle law, which I said is basically like trying to silence judges, but also is trying to keep like the achieved status quo concerning those changes implemented by the government, is a huge threat to the judicial independence, and I'm not certain whether it will be possible to stop this process. And just recently I started to say that what we are experiencing these days is a start of so-called legal poll exit. By legal poll exit, I mean exiting of Poland from the European Union, but not like in a formal way, but by simply ignoring legal obligations that are coming with the European Union membership. And we may start asking questions, what would be the next step. The good thing which happened recently is a pluralism of a debate. Here is a picture of the Polish Senate. Senate, interestingly, is right now in the majority of Senate is the opposition, but Senate under the Polish constitution does not have a blocking majority. It may discuss laws, it may create a room for a debate, for a very pluralistic debate, but still at the end of the day, it is the parliament which is, it is the lower chamber which may overturn any resolution by the Senate of the Republic. And this photo is very special to me because it is one of the most prominent Polish judges, Judge Zabłocki, president of the criminal chamber, who was speaking against one of those laws adopted by the parliament. In fact, today, Judge Zabłocki decided to retire because he does not want to be a judge when the Muzzle law enters into force. To conclude, I think, okay, sorry, okay, not yet. I think, the big question is, what is the future of Poland? What is the future of Poland? I think that what we experience now is a drive towards a system of competitive authoritarianism. I use here the theory by Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way. It is a system which provides for operation of different democratic institutions, but in fact they are becoming facade. And the whole system is created in such a way as that opponents cannot effectively compete with those in power. And here, okay, the slide, okay. It will work this way, that for example, one of those practices of the competitive authoritarianism is the practice of so-called discriminatory legalism, which means that you initiate different cases against your opponents, and judges, when they have a case which is of political nature on their desk, they will perfectly know how not to cross a line, how not to create problems for yourself from the point of view of your career, disciplinary responsibility. So if this scenario continues, the question is about Polish membership in the European Union, but also it is a question about transatlantic relations and also the strategic alliance with the United States. But there is also a positive scenario. It may happen that Poland will be back on the democratic track, but certainly if we'll be back on this democratic track, this democracy afterwards would look completely different as it was before. Because we'll have to rebuild the justice system, we'll have to unwrap reforms, and it may take even a generation to do it. We'll have to assure citizens about coming back to the line of continuity as regards future development of Poland, to secure stability and deepening of the rule of law compliance. And if this scenario is somehow possible, of course it depends on number of circumstances, including electoral verdict. The Poland could be simply like a big warning to the whole world, how you can dismantle rule of law. But because Poland could become this big warning, it might, as a consequence, be like a good lesson for democratization of other countries in the world. And I hope that maybe that would be the future of Poland. But of course, I cannot predict right now. And upon lack of predictability, my only answer is that you have to work hard in order to resist, to defend principles of liberal democracy. You have to use your imagination and skills as much as you can. Because you have the responsibility for future generations, and you cannot just accept the reality as it is. And here, as a final slide, I would like to present you Karol Modzelewski. Karol Modzelewski, Polish hero who spent more than 8 years in communist prisons. I had a privilege to know him and met him before he passed away 2 years ago. And in a private conversation in 2016, he said to me, "Now you are the battle soldier. Now you are the battle soldier." He said also that every generation has a certain price to be paid, a certain price to be suffered. And I feel privileged that I'm one of many devoted battle soldiers, together with Polish judges, members of academia, activists, and citizens on streets. And I'm honored that we can enjoy support of allied forces who show us solidarity and trust. I treat you as our allied forces. Thank you very much. Okay, so you moderate. Okay.
I'm sorry, my voice is not very good today.
But please come.
We have time for maybe a couple of questions. If you have to leave for class, go. And again, Mr. Bodnar will have a session with students at 2:30 in the faculty lounge, just an informal chat. But if you have a question now, we probably have time for one or two. Microphones? Anybody? Question? Please.
Hello. Thank you for being here. I'm curious what role you've seen journalism play in all of this. I know you talked about national broadcasting and sort of the national media, but I'm curious what role other journalism in the country has played, if you've noticed a split, sort of a war for domination of narratives and things like that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very relevant question. Of course, we have a certain group of journalists, if they could be named as journalists, who are working in public radio and television, but also who are working in different media outlets, who are more or less supporting government. But it is not just support for free. In Poland, we do not have like those kind of significant billionaires that are investing into media. But we have very powerful state-owned companies that are providing some selected media outlets with commercials. So you can be a tiny magazine, but you get money for commercials, and it is a significant money, which means that you cannot be critical towards the government. Being in the US, I must say that one of the most important institutions protecting democracy these days is the private television, which is called TVN24, which is ownership of Discovery Networks. And it seems that United States is treating this as a little bit as a strategic investment. Interestingly, there was one attempt to purchase by state-owned companies of this television station from Americans, but fortunately this attempt has been refused. So you have a lot of journalists these days who are very much devoted to democratic cause, who are doing a lot of investigative journalism, But please look that we have this kind of a theory of Teflon. Teflon, you have this on the pan, that you can make like a discovery of an even biggest affair, and then the government is basically very resilient to respond to this because it controls prosecutor's office, secret services, and other ways of giving a story in the public domain. So we see something like emergence or like rebirth of investigative journalism, but still it seems it is not strong enough to stop this process of changes that is happening in Poland because of those other material reasons, but also a coverage of public radio and television in different rural areas. If you are interested, interestingly, if you look into reports by Reporters Without Borders, in 2015 we were more or less like on the 20th, 22nd position in the world. Right now we are somewhere like 58th position, and there are also some cases, individual cases pending against journalists. So as long as courts are independent, those journalists seem more or less like secure. But if the courts are subordinated, then I would not like to be in the shoes of a journalist who is critical towards the government.
So it is after 1 o'clock, and we try to keep these on time, so I'm going to just let Dean.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Asper.